First of all, thanks to the organisers for inviting me. My talks, or my imminent research in high-value nutrition is really a step further towards the industry end of things than what you've heard so far. So my work is specifically related to kiwifruit and is partially funded by the kiwifruit industry. What I'll do is go over some of the properties of kiwifruit that could be beneficial, what we've done to show that these properties act in vivo, and then go on to briefly talk about how the data might be able to be used by consumers and where we go in our next phase of HVN research. Well, the overall aim of the research is, of course, to help Zespriphase sell kiwifruit into the Asian market, which is, as Sally's mentioned, developing a very high incidence of diabetes and glucose intolerance, and so there's a risk of it becoming sugar averse, and that might damage the demand for kiwifruit. So yeah, becoming fearful of sugars. The kiwifruit are basically a little bag of sugars with cell walls holding them together, and they're about 50% fructose, and of course there's quite a lot of negative press about fructose, much of it unjustified because a lot of the studies on the harmful effects of fructose have been done in very high dose studies, and in actual fact the sort of proportions of fructose and glucose that you get in fruit are complementary in their functions. And what we want to show is that if kiwifruit are used in the right way in the diet, they can actually make a positive contribution to managing glucose intolerance. So this is the problem that's been already mentioned. Asia is a very important market for kiwifruit, and Asia is the sort of future of the kiwifruit market, if you like, but it's undergoing a tsunami of diabetes. So we want to show that that kiwifruit in the diet can have benefits short term, in other words, postprandial, in other words, after a meal, immediately after a meal, and in the long term, because one of the problems about hyperglycemia and glucose intolerance is that over an extended period you get a whole range of diabetic complications related to disturbed metabolism, including the polyol pathway that's just been mentioned. So we want to know how to incorporate kiwifruit into the diet. Well, we've started off by looking at some of the properties of kiwifruit that's been digested in vitro, and this little graph shows what happens to kiwifruit upon in vitro digestion. You can see the volume of the fruit and the cell walls, the entire fruit minus the skin in the two left-hand bars. This is with green and gold kiwifruit. Then after in vitro digestion and allowing the digested material to settle, you see there's about a four-fold increase in the volume of the settled bed of kiwifruit debris. So one kiwifruit, which is about a volume of 100 mils, would give rise to about 400 mils of the debris, and two kiwifruit, 800 mils, and that really occupies quite a big volume of the stomach, quite a big proportion of the stomach volume, and interacts with other foods. And within that, that settled bed of kiwifruit debris, processes that are involved in the glycemic response can be modified because of the rheological properties of the matrix, if you like, due to the interaction of the fibres. And you can see here that some of the processes involved in the glycemic response, such as digestion, it's illustrated by simulated glycemic response curves on the left, and diffusion in the middle graph, and the rate of mixing on the right are all retarded by within that matrix. So the next step was to see whether this multifaceted effect of the kiwifruit debris might act in vivo. So what we did was feed subjects a wheat and breakfast cereal, and we added the kiwifruit sugars to the cereal, or we added kiwifruit. So the only difference between the responses of the two diets could be attributed to the non-sugar components of the kiwifruit, which were also responsible for the rheological effects I showed you in the previous slide. And you can see that in the presence of the kiwifruit, the amplitude of the response is quite reduced, and also you don't get the hypoglycemic overshoot. So the homeostatic response to the presence of the sugar, or that is derived from the starch in the wheat and breakfast cereal, plus the added sugars, is much improved in the presence of the kiwifruit. But to take a more dietetic approach, we'd want to partially substitute the wheaten biscuit with kiwifruit, because that would keep the intake of carbohydrates constant. It would be a sort of isocaloric substitution. And you can see in this slide, the two lower graphs, lower lines show the blood glucose response in the presence of kiwifruit. In this case, the kiwifruit's about 50% substituted the wheat and breakfast cereal, and the glucose reference and the wheat and breakfast cereal are the two higher graphs, and these are all at the same carbohydrate intake. So there's really quite a big effect of partial substitution of kiwifruit, which could be beneficial, and that would be due to the physicochemical properties I showed you a couple of slides ago, and also the fact that fructose is substituting glucose. And you can see from the little black bars on the histogram that show the 120 to 180 minute area under the blood glucose response curve, that in the case of the wheat mix and glucose reference, the two left-hand groups of bars, there's hypoglycemia and just a very slight elevation above baseline in the presence of the kiwifruit. So to make this information available to consumers, we have to communicate what kind of effect might be had. We need to be able to talk in terms of the functional effect. And one way of doing this is in terms of glucose equivalence. In other words, expressing the glycemic impact of a food in terms of the amount of glucose that would have the same effect. And well, in this one, in this experiment, we measured the response to kiwifruit, gold and green, compared with the glucose reference. And that allowed us to work out that the kiwifruit has a much lower effect per 100 grams. In the graph on the left, you can see that. It's equivalent to about 6.5 grams of sugar, compared with about 46.5 for the wheat and breakfast cereal per 100 grams. But of course, we don't consume 100 grams. We consume foods on a serving basis. And if you look at things on a serving basis, you can see that the kiwifruit still have a pretty low response per serving compared with a lot of other foods. So 100 grams kiwifruit. So what that does is it allows us to express the glycemic impact of kiwifruit in terms of glucose equivalence. So you can see in this slide down the bottom where the red arrow is that the food label, if it was allowed to be presented like this, would be saying that that this one kiwifruit, which happens to be the same as one serving, is equivalent in its effect to 6 grams of glucose. It's a very easy way of communicating glycemic potency to consumers. And this is where I need my speaks. Hope you don't. So once we've got that sort of glucose equivalent currency to explain the effects of kiwifruit, we can develop kiwifruit exchange tables. And you can see fourth column on down the bottom, 1 kiwifruit and 2 kiwifruits, showing the glucose equivalents per fruit for 5.8 glucose equivalents for 1 kiwifruit, 11.5 for 2. And you can also see that substituting kiwifruit for carbohydrate, in the case of bread, for instance, if you look at the grey columns on the right, exchanging 1 kiwifruit would decrease the glycemic response in terms of glucose equivalents by about 16%, just looking at the top line. And 2 would reduce it by about 32%. And when you consider that the high glycemic index cutoff point is 70 and low is 55, that's only a 15% difference. Substituting 1 kiwifruit for carbohydrate in some of these foods is like going from a high glycemic index to a low glycemic index situation. And of course, if you're doing that with kiwifruit, because it's a whole food, unprocessed, it's got lots of other components in it. You can see that the vitamin C content is greatly increased, even though the carbohydrate intake is exactly the same. So it's a good way of improving the nutrient balance in the diet as well. Another aspect to consider is just how would you distribute kiwifruit in the diet? What would be the best time to have it? And what this graph shows is that substituting sun-gold kiwifruit for wheat and biscuit, in the middle graph, it's actually reduced the area under the curve by about 40%. But if you give the kiwifruit half an hour before the wheat and biscuit, you see that the curve is quite drastically changed. The amplitude is very much reduced. It's sort of been decapitated. And that shows the effect on appetite. There are actually three graphs there, except for the first half hour, 2 of them are exactly superimposed. But the graph that starts on the left is of the kiwifruit partially substituting wheat mix, but being fed half an hour before the wheat and biscuit. But all the same, the appetite drops down to about the same level as giving the entire carbohydrate dose as wheat mix or substituted wheat mix together. So probably incorporating kiwifruit into the diet, it probably doesn't need any particularly sophisticated kind of sort of dietary management, because the change in appetite will probably take care of it. But that's future research. So that's work that's already been done, and we're just about to get our high-value nutrition research underway. We've been through the most difficult bit, getting the contract signed, but we're almost through that now. But with the emphasis on high-value nutrition, we need to start thinking more in terms of health claims and consumer safety, the relevance to customary food consumption patterns, the mechanisms involved which might be able to support health claims, and developing relevant endpoints and biomarkers, which I hope Sally Poppet will be able to contribute, although we need to probably get on with it before her work's gone that far. So our next steps in the research, they're sort of outlined here. In the left-hand red boxes, we've got a pilot study that we're about to get underway, which isn't part of HVN, but it will feed into HVN. And the HVN study is in the green box over 3 years. And in the first year, this year in other words, we'll be looking at the effects of kiwifruit in a realistic sort of meal setting, rather than just with a wheat and breakfast cereal, which is a sort of model food. And then following that, we'll move on to the longer term effects of kiwifruit in healthy individuals. In other words, we'll be looking for any metabolic effects that might come from the increased intake of fructose. That would be one of the major concerns. And then beyond that, we'll be looking at the effects in pre-diabetic individuals and taking a much more in-depth look at various aspects and various markers like insulin response. And I think that might be it. Oh yes, acknowledgements, of course, to Zespriphase, who've contributed to this, and to the various people involved in the work that I've described. So that's me.